On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
These measures are directed against individuals who directly contribute to extremist settler violence. The measures are not directed against the state of Israel itself. Canada remains.
That's Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand outlining the reasons why on Tuesday of this week, Canada, together with the UK, Norway, Australia, and New Zealand, slapped personal, economic, and travel sanctions on two of Israel's most controversial high-profile cabinet ministers, who also happen to be right-wing West Bank settlers, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, and Itamar Ben Gvir, national security chief. Smotrich has publicly urged the possible ethnic cleansing and destruction of Gaza and the relocation of its residents to third countries. But Ben Gvir has been convicted 8 times of incitement to racism against Palestinians. The sanctions mean the two politicians cannot travel to Canada or to the other 4 countries, and if they have any financial assets or real estate in the 5 countries, these will be frozen. And any Canadians who try to help them get around the sanctions here or abroad could face a $25,000 fine or prison time, in some cases up to 5 years. It'll be left up to the RCMP and to the Canadian Border Services Agency to enforce the new rules. Canadian banks and companies have to report whether Ben Gvir or Smotrich have any holdings here. We don't know whether they do, or if the Canadians or if Canada was on their next travel list. But that isn't really the point, experts say. The sanctions are more of a sign of extreme displeasure with the Israeli government and their treatment of Palestinians, and frustration with the recent approval of another 22 new Israeli settlements.
People can legitimately disagree with the sanctions. People can legitimately disagree with the details of what is going on. But it is more broadly indicative of a more serious approach to foreign policy.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Friday the 13th, June 13th, 2025. Welcome to North Star, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Canada has a few different legal methods to crack down on bad actors from other countries and terrorist groups and rogue governments too, like Iran and Russia and Sudan and North Korea and Lebanon, for example. Now, Israel is not on those lists because it's a Western democratic country. The tool Canada used in this case is called SEMA. That's short for the Special Economic Measures Regulations. Although experts say prosecutions are rarely carried out, still at the end of May, Canadian police did charge for the first time a Russian national who lives in Toronto for supplying parts for military drones to Russia to be used against Ukraine. The particular SEMA regulations on Israeli settlers have actually only been in effect for over a year, since May 2024, when the Americans under the Biden administration started sanctioning settlers too. Before today, 15 Israeli Jewish settlers and 7 organizations are persona non grata in Canada. These include the Hilltop Youth, who build illegal outposts, and another group that opposes intermarriage between Jews and Arabs. Several of these sanctioned settlers have close ties to Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and one is the grandson of an extremist Israeli rabbi, Meir Kahane. When the earlier sanctions were brought down last year, Ben Gvir called them anti-Semitism against people building the Holy Land in Judea and Samaria. But Canada says the two Israeli right-wing leaders encourage violent attacks on Palestinian civilians. Ottawa says there's been an estimated 1,800 incidents since October 7th alone, and in most cases, the politicians let the perpetrators get away with it, none of which Canada says is helpful for peace and stability as it leads to forced displacement of Palestinians. So why did Canada announce these new sanctions now? To explain, I reached out to Professor Thomas Junot. He's a Middle East expert and professor of political science at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. And he joins me now.
Thanks for having me.
So we're talking after the Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister announced that they are joining with other countries to sanction more Israeli, quote, extremist, unquote, settlers on the West Bank. The thing, though, is that these are also sitting cabinet ministers in the Israeli government. How unusual or draconian is this move for a Western allied democracy nation to have two cabinet minister sanctions?
It is absolutely unusual. And I mean that in technical terms, whether one agrees or disagrees with the decision, it's unusual. The fact that 5 countries, not just Canada, right, also the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway, so as you said, all democratic allies or friends of Canada and close partners of Israel would sanction ministers, the symbol is powerful and it's very unusual. And I'm not aware of precedents. And I've heard a lot of people say they're not aware of precedents. I think we can assume that it's the first time, at least until I actually see a precedent. The symbol is powerful. Materially, the impact is actually limited. These 2 individuals probably didn't have the intention of coming to Canada anyways. Now they are barred from entry. I'm not aware of these 2 individuals having financial interests in Canada. There might be some, but I'm not aware. But, for them to be barred from financial transactions with a country like Canada is not going to act as a major deterrent. So it's more on the symbolic side that it matters.
Right. Canada has done a lot of sanctions recently under the previous Trudeau administration. IRGC, finally, after 6 years of, trying to get them to put the IRGC and sanction Iranian regime bad guys to freeze their assets when they came here to try to escape into the diaspora here. But in terms of the other rogue nations, Belarus and Russia, like Israel's on the list now with these settlers, but not the country. Can you explain the difference in terms of who is getting sanctioned?
That's a good question because there's a lot of different tools that can be used here that have different kinds of impact. You mentioned the IRGC, for example, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the Praetorian Guard or the ideological military of the Islamic Republic, which was added to the list of terrorist entities under the criminal code. So that's a different tool. It's not what we're talking about here. It leads to different impacts, different implications. What Canada did now was not to Israel. It was to 2 individuals. And there is in practice a distinction, even though I fully understand that symbolically and psychologically or emotionally for a lot of people, that distinction doesn't matter. The Canadian government is using 2 tools against them. One is under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which bars them from entry into Canada. That is a tool that we have widely used against individuals, officials, military officials in some cases, from regimes that have done governments that have done things we disagreed with on the human rights front. So the logic here is that their aggressive support for settlements in the West Bank, their calls for annexation of parts of the West Bank, and more broadly, even though it wasn't clearly said yesterday, their calls for the mass displacement of the Gazan population so that Israel can more or less take possession of the Gaza Strip, that fits into the broad agenda of barring them from entry into Canada. The second tool that we used is something called the Special Economic Measures Act, or SEMA, which is very complicated and pretty quickly it gets into a technical dimension that is above my pay grade. But by and large, what it means is that any financial asset that they would have here in Canada would be frozen, and it bars Canadians or Canadian entities, i.e. businesses, from transactions with them. Whether that actually matters or not, in the sense, do they have bank accounts in Toronto, these 2 individuals, I don't personally know. Typically, the Canadian government would not say that because of the Privacy Act. But again, here, the idea is the symbol of making those 2 moves against these 2 individuals, Smotrich and Ben Gvir. there.
What about the timing? It's very interesting because of all the international meetings that are coming up in Canada and New York. Can you situate the timing of this statement with what we're going to see in the G7 in Kananaskis and maybe even the New York meetings where recognition of a Palestinian state was on the agenda?
So it's interesting that you mentioned the G7 because I'm actually curious as to what, if any, role the Israeli-Palestinian issue will have on the G7 agenda, because the U.S., as of about 5 p.m. on Tuesday evening, clearly expressed its opposition to these sanctions. The G7, with everything going on with Mr. Trump that we talk about extensively, will be very difficult. It will be an extraordinarily fragile equilibrium for Prime Minister Carney to host this G7 without the whole thing imploding. So if I had to guess, and this is purely a guess, I would say that Prime Minister Carney will try not to have Israel on the agenda, just because there will be more than enough reasons for the whole thing to blow up, given Mr. Trump's personality. I might be wrong, of course, on this. The timing, I think you have to go back to about 3 weeks when Canada, France, and the UK issued a statement threatening further action against Israel if it didn't facilitate, among other things, the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza.
But the sanctions were those were not sanctions, just so we remind our listeners. Those were measures. They didn't say what they would be. The sanctions were for these settlements, which then 2 days after, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to give our listeners context in case they haven't been following, 2 days after the statement came out on our Victoria Day weekend, May 19th, Israel allowed 22 more settlements. The government of Israel approved 22 more settlements to go ahead. And yesterday's sanctions statement from Anita Anand basically specifically said, we told you, we tried to tell you, we said don't do more settlements, and you went ahead anyway. So I'm wondering, you go back 3 weeks, but then stuff has happened since. So maybe they were waiting and this was the shoe that dropped, and now they had to, draft the wording and get the law organized in order, and then agreed with all the other nations of the timing, but maybe that was already on the they were watching for this. Yeah. And Israel's like thumbed their nose and they said, okay, we're going to get you.
I think your take is correct. I think that Canada and the UK, to some extent, painted themselves in a corner. It's a corner they could have walked out of course. You can always do that. As Jean-Chrétien said, you could just walk on the paint, right, if you've painted yourself in a corner. But there was an expectation that they would do something after that statement. I think beyond what has happened in the last 3 weeks and that specific statement, there has been growing irritation in Canada, going back to the Trudeau government, in many European countries, even in the U.S., and that would be a separate conversation, but even in the U.S., there is growing irritation, impatience, however you want to call it, with Israel because of the war in Gaza, because of the humanitarian assistance dimension there, because of expanding settlements and more broadly expanding military operations in the West Bank. So that broader trend of growing irritation is essential to understand here why that decision was made.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
So let's continue about the coming meeting in New York, where many nations are coming to talk about the possible two-state solution and possible recognition unilaterally of the Palestinian state. This sanctions announcement comes, and the timing of that. In your opinion, do you think Canada is using sort of this runway to then go ahead and on that meeting in New York say we're recognizing Palestine?
I honestly don't know what Canada will do in New York, whether Canada will recognize Palestine or not. A small number of European countries, Spain, for example, have already made that recognition. There are rumors that others will do it at the New York meeting in June, perhaps France, which is the co-host of that meeting and has been playing obviously a big political role as the driver behind this meeting, working a lot with Saudi Arabia in particular to try to get things moving on the two-state solution front. There has been talk that Canada could also do that. I have no special insight into Prime Minister Carney's thinking on this issue. To me, the fact that he was willing to adopt these two sanctions against Israeli ministers shows that he's willing to rock the boat a bit on this issue. But whether he will take that extra step, I don't know. It's important to understand, right, that recognition of a Palestinian state at this point is symbolic and will not create that Palestinian state. That will only come as a result of direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority or some kind of Palestinian entity. The logic is that both sanctions by countries like Canada and the UK and recognition of a Palestinian state symbolically will put pressure on Israel to negotiate, will incentivize Israel to negotiate, and will also provide momentum to eventual negotiations. It's a bit of a risky calculus. It's not guaranteed to work at all, but that's the logic behind it.
Well, maybe this new survey that came out about 50% of Canadians now think Israel's committing genocide. It was a Leger poll that came out yesterday or today. Ottawa watches what happens in the public opinion before they do anything, and so this might give them input. I mean, half don't. So,
and absolutely, and I would add on that point that within Western democracies in general, including in the U.S., there is a steady shift of popular opinion in favor of the Palestinians and critical of Israel. We've seen it, including in the U.S. And what is interesting in the U.S. is, and by interesting I mean in the noteworthy sense, right, is that you see that among Democrats, but you also see that among Republicans, where there is a faction or factions within the Republican Party on the MAGA right, and some of these individuals are deeply anti-Semitic, so that obviously plays into that, but who are very critical of Israel. So there's a lot of movement on that level, and if I were the Israeli government, or if I were an activist in Israel, I would be concerned about that.
You spoke about the Israeli government, so we have to, of course, bring up the fact that against all this backdrop of all this stuff is happening, there's also the possibility that there will be elections in Israel. The government will collapse any moment now. There's all this stuff about the right wings are going to leave, the extremists are going to leave, Ben Gvir and Smotrich are going to leave, and the coalition will collapse. So what should we understand about this as all these sanctions are now coming out?
Well, it's that adds a new layer to an already extraordinarily complicated equation. There are some analysts who are making the case that sanctioning Ben Gvir and Smotrich by Canada and other allies can provide impetus, if you will, to marginalize them in a future coalition-forming exercise inside Israel. I have my doubts as to whether that can actually work. Netanyahu, I think, has clearly shown that he's more than willing to thumb his nose to international pressure. Obviously, Smotrich and Ben Gvir themselves do not care. They've been quite vocal about that. Plus, I think we should all be mindful and careful of lesser powers like Canada and the UK trying to intervene or being perceived as intervening, even if it's not the actual intent, in Israeli elections and democratic processes. So that part I'm a bit uncomfortable with.
Because Canada shouldn't be overthrowing a democratic country, even if you don't like their policies.
I don't think overthrowing it would be the right word, because that's too strong. I don't think we should overthrow.
Regime change, right, of course.
But if it is perceived as meddling, even if it's not overthrowing, if it's a couple notches below, the perception can be a challenge.
Okay, so you mentioned, and this will be my last question, you mentioned Canada, UK. Why do you think this strategy is being used by Canada to be part of the posse, and I'm saying it in a nice way, part of the group? They're doing it as a group and not alone. All these sanctions, they're all teaming up with the boys around the block. What's the reason they would do this instead of acting on their own?
So I'm happy you asked that question because that is an essential point. If Canada acts alone on an issue like this, it has absolutely no impact. And the only reason why it does it, it's for domestic consumption. And in a democracy, it's normal, and you can't pretend that elected governments will not make foreign policy decisions on the basis of partisan considerations. That's part of the game. But the reality is that when Canada does that, it has precisely zero impact outside of our borders. Again, whether we agree with it or not. If Canada is to have an impact on international issues, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but others too, the argument absolutely applies elsewhere, it needs to act in coordination with allies. That's the only way that we can have an impact. And then it is possible to have one. So here, I'm actually happy that the performative aspect, the theatrical aspect of foreign policy under the previous government, where clearly the only objective was domestic consumption, which for a foreign policy analyst like me, and I'm not a domestic politics specialist, I'm not involved in any political party, I used to find that very discouraging. Now, if there is, by this government, an effort to work with allies on the basis of common interests to try to shape outcomes, that's more serious. And in the world we're in now, with a potentially very difficult American administration to the south, we need to firm up these partnerships with countries like the UK and Australia in particular, France, but also Japan, South Korea, et cetera, et cetera. And I would add Saudi Arabia and India, right?
Right, they're coming to the G7, Modi and MBS.
Though MBS, there's no confirmation yet, but at least the invitation was launched. So to me, the fact that Canada is closely working with allies here is a good sign.
So Canada's back under the new...
I completely refuse to use Canada's back because that was ruined 10 years ago. But I'll take the broader point.
It's been great to go through these points with you. I'm sure we'll speak again as this develops. Thank you so much for being on the North Star with me.
Nice to chat. Thank you.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Israel's foreign minister commented that the sanctions are outrageous and said his government will convene a special meeting next week and discuss what to do. Smotrich ordered the finance ministry to freeze the movement of money between Israeli banks and financial institutions in the West Bank in an effort to paralyze the Palestinian economy, because mostly the currency the West Bank uses is Israeli shekels. Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, condemned the sanctions and wants them reversed because he says they hurt the American effort to achieve a ceasefire, bring the hostages home, and end the war. Our show is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman and Andrea Varsany. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman, and our music is by Brett Higgins. Thanks for listening.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.